to this last session of the day at the EPIP 2020 online conference. I am the Vice President of the association, and also I was going to host the physical conference in Madrid this year at these same dates, but unfortunately, due to the COVID-19, we had to postpone it to 2021. I want to introduce you to Lisa Ouellet, Associate Professor of Stanford Law School, who has written extensively on legal issues related to intellectual property and COVID-19, but always with an empirical and theoretical view behind. And Joshua Gans, Professor of Strategic Management at Rotman School of Management, University of Toronto, who not only is writing a newsletter on COVID-19 since recently, but wrote a book called Economics in the Age of COVID-19. When we were only waking up, he had already published the book with MIT Press. The other members of the panel are Philippe Gori, who is a medical doctor and associate professor at the School of Pharmacy in Bordeaux University, and also a researcher in the economics department of Bordeaux University. Finally, Chirantan Chatterjee from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad in India, associate professor in business policy and economics, ICICI Bank Chair in Strategic Management, Indian Institute, as I said, of Management, and visiting fellow, Hoover Institution, Stanford University.
Everyone for joining from across the globe and making time for this today. So I want to start by noting that my thinking on COVID-19 innovation issues is based on work that I've done with a number of wonderful co-authors, including Stanford PhD student Claire Shui and my law professor co-bloggers, Rachel Sachs, Jacob Shirkow, and Nicholson Price, with whom I've written over 20 blog posts about various aspects of law and COVID innovation. So there are lots of interesting legal questions that I could discuss, but given the limited time, I'm going to focus right now on ideas that I've developed with Daniel Hemmel of the University of Chicago on the connection between providing incentives for new innovations and promoting access to existing innovations, particularly in the context of COVID-19 vaccines, because I think that this issue is continuing to cause confusion in innovation policy discussions. So, to start, I think there's a strong economic and moral case for free global access to a vaccine that is shown to be safe and effective. And to be clear, a vaccine won't solve everything because it will take time to distribute, it won't be 100% effective. So it certainly shouldn't be our only policy priority, but it would be a big step toward controlling this pandemic. But this case for free access has led many commentators to say that we have to limit profits and patent rights for vaccine developers. And I think this is because the conventional understanding of the patent system is that it creates an inevitable trade-off between innovation and access. And that's why the main strategy of advocates for access to medicines has been focused on limiting patent rights and encouraging competition from generic manufacturers. But what Daniel and I have explained in a number of pieces now is that this innovation access trade-off is a false framing, particularly for medical innovations. And I think the main conceptual mistake that keeps getting made in these discussions is not distinguishing between out-of-pocket costs for patients and the entirely separate question of financial rewards for developers. In many countries, people will get free access to a vaccine through national healthcare systems. In the US here, things are more confusing, but Americans will get free access through government insurance or through private insurance that's required to cover vaccines with no out-of-pocket costs, or through a program that the federal government has created to cover COVID-19 treatment and vaccines for uninsured patients. So vaccines can be free to patients even if their developers make enormous profits. And you might say, okay, so we could have free access and large profits, but isn't limiting profits still a good thing? And that's what lots of people have argued since the start of the pandemic, ranging from Nobel Prize winning economists to yesterday I saw something from the Pope saying no one should profit from the pandemic. And this summer, some vaccine manufacturers, Moderna, Merck, and Pfizer, were all heavily criticized when they were testifying before the US Congress and wouldn't commit to selling their vaccines for no profit. But profits are important because the human capital and facilities related to vaccine development are largely concentrated in the private sector. There isn't any government or nonprofit that can manufacture vaccines at scale. And we want vaccine developers to do things they normally wouldn't, like scaling up manufacturing for promising vaccine candidates before we know whether they'll work. And even if a large reward has only a small chance of speeding up access to a vaccine, it would be worth it because of the enormous cost of the pandemic. Like if you just look at one measure in the US, COVID-19 is estimated to add about 10 billion per day to our federal deficit. So small increases in the speed with which this comes to an end can pay for themselves pretty quickly. I think a lot of the concerns about the cost of rewards for COVID-19 innovation to government budgets have reflected a failure to think about the priorities and magnitudes here. And perhaps even more importantly, I think rewarding vaccine developers in this pandemic will help us do a better job with the next one. We know that both the public and the private sector invested far too little in vaccine research before this pandemic because of both political and market failures. There are a bunch of reasons that even a firm with full monopoly power will make less from a vaccine than from a therapeutic for the same disease, all else equal. And some private sector firms that made investments before this pandemic that were the basis of the vaccines they're making now. But if no one makes money on this pandemic because of demands to give everything away for free, then we're going to face the same overall underinvestment problem next time. And thinking about the next pandemic is important because there's going to be a next pandemic. There's a long list of world leaders and public health experts before 2020 warning us about the very real threat of a lethal and economically devastating pandemic and noting that the world wasn't ready for it, including because we didn't invest enough in vaccine R&D. And the fact that they were right and that we're living through this now doesn't mean that it's less likely to happen again soon. Okay, so if you're convinced that we do want firms to earn substantial investments, substantial profits on investments they've made in vaccine technologies, I think there's still a separate question of whether they should earn them through the patent system or through other kinds of rewards. Back in March, Daniel Hemmel and I argued for offering a prize per patient vaccinated, known as a advanced market commitment or AMC, similar to the one that was used in a partnership between some governments and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for incentivizing distribution of a vaccine against pneumococcal disease. You could also imagine a large prize for anyone who gets a vaccine approved and then puts it in the public domain. Or the government could use tools like a patent buyout or compulsory licensing to reward the developer while then allowing anyone to manufacture. And I think for some technologies, the question of whether manufacturing and distribution is best coordinated by a single firm or left to a competitive market is an interesting debate. For vaccines, I think the interest that's been shown in limiting patent rights through tools like compulsory licensing is largely academic because as a practical matter right now, patents are redundant with other forms of IP. Vaccines aren't like small molecule drugs that have a healthy generic industry. They're complex biologics that are heavily protected with trade secrecy law. And the generic version of biologics, known as biosimilars, have started coming on the market recently, with Europe doing a better job than the US, but there aren't any biosimilar vaccines. And the FDA and EMA and WHO haven't even issued guidelines on the regulatory steps that would be needed for approval of a biosimilar vaccine. So it's not like we can get rid of patents and expect a bunch of firms to start manufacturing the vaccine without cooperation from the developer. So I think these difficulties in transferring knowledge related to vaccine manufacturing are a separate problem and one that legal institutions can also address. There have been some nice pieces recently on this, including one by Ken Shadlin, who I see in the audience here, and one more recently by my co-blogger Nicholson Price, along with Artie Rai and Timo Minson. And they focused on this problem of knowledge transfer, described various ways to use incentives or mandates to encourage greater knowledge sharing about vaccine manufacturing details. But I think that right now, the point is that patents are largely a sideshow in the vaccine context. So Daniel Hemmel and I now have a 50-page draft article on vaccine incentives that goes into many more of the details on this, including how rewards should be calculated, why we think the right lodestar for awards is the social value provided by the vaccine rather than simply allowing firms to recover their development costs, some of the international dimensions here. But I think I'd like to have time for discussion with my fellow panelists. So I will just wrap up now by saying that I think getting a safe and effective vaccine approved and rapidly scaling up production and providing free global access to that vaccine should all be high policy priorities. And these priorities are not in conflict. Politicians can use legal mechanisms to achieve all of these goals. And I think that in setting innovation policy for vaccines, figuring out how to effectively mobilize the private sector seems crucial. So the goal shouldn't be no profits, it should be doing a much better job of aligning the profit incentive with things that are socially valuable. So I will stop there, but I look.
Lisa covered all of the first order issues with respect to IP and COVID, and namely this, if we're going to rely on traditional incentive mechanisms, we cannot at the same time pretend that the profit motive isn't what's driving it, and that would set the tone for future things. That is most definitely the traditional argument. Obviously, with respect to vaccines, there has been a drop everything and start working on vaccines mentality that's been going on. There are hundreds of papers, many different efforts, and what is likely the case is they have not been driven by necessarily the profit motive. I don't think that the business case for doing vaccines has changed appreciably during COVID, except that we now have resources and willingness to divert to it. And so I think that's will end up being part of the narrative going on here. But it's all doesn't really matter. The magnitudes are so big, no amount of money that we throw at this problem will fail a cost-benefit analysis. So we're in this situation where it's very obvious where we should be directing social energies. But there is one cost to the vaccine priority. The vaccine is currently the policy of most countries that haven't rid ourselves of this virus entirely. And by policy, it's the thoughts and prayers version of dealing with COVID. Just a few things that we must recognize about that. One, we've never ever produced a vaccine to end a pandemic, let alone a global one. It's never been the end game of that. It's been the end game for diseases, polio, measles, smallpox, going on for, in some cases, millennia. It's been for that. It's been, in other words, it's been a solution that has worked with time, but it's never been one that's worked with urgency. The reason for that, we should recognize, are the reasons we're facing up right now as we move into these phase 3 trials. One, it takes a while. You know, vaccines, when you sort of look at the science of it, they're actually risky. There's a reason why people get nervous about vaccines. Here's the school child version of it. We're going to infect you with a little bit of the disease and hope it works out. Now, so that's not how all these things work. And there's some there's more sophisticated things, but that is at least the perception, and I don't think it goes much deeper than that. Secondly, even with the consequences and concerns about side effects, particularly based on age and comorbidities and all the other things that we're currently worried about, there's also an issue of effectiveness. You know, our regular flu vaccines, which is the only one we do on some sort of cycle, has varying effectiveness. Now, the problem that we have associated with that is what's going to be a success measurement here. We would like, if you can come up with a 100% effective vaccine, we want to give you more than if you do 50%. But the FDA has just said they'll approve anything with 50%. And so people are just trying to get to that threshold. We kind of have lowered the bar. And so that's an issue as well. But vaccines, the other consequence of it is they're getting all the attention. And the problem is that in our totality of the innovations needed to deal with COVID and needed to be dealt with rapidly, I actually think vaccines are third on the list. First on the list are treatments. That is the ability to have treatments that will mean that if you contract this virus, you don't end up either dying or having a long-term illness from it. And we've done pretty well on that. I mean, there's been a huge amount of learning there. The reason the case fatality rates are way down is because there's been success. Now, part of that success has come from repurposing things that were currently on patent. They're great things to repurpose because the property rights are secure, the FDA approvals are nearly met. But there are a whole lot of things that are off patent that are now in the generic category. The problem is the incentives to go through even the streamlined regulatory processes for that are muted if you do not have intellectual property protection. So my co-author and Lisa's colleague, Susan Athey, and others have been working on this repurposing. And so I think that's a first order issue. And then finally, we have a new issue coming up with regard to, so the second set of innovations that we need are information innovations, such as tests, better ways of contact tracing, etc. Those are actually very important because they can cause us to not have to worry about vaccines at all in terms of solving this. And we currently have, and I don't think IP is the challenge there. I actually think that it is the other approvals and other things that slow down, create frictions in the innovation system, which is equally legally valid for interest to this audience. I've spent the last few months working with our startup program here, trying to get startups that were going to innovate along all these dimensions, but most notably on the information dimension. And the big barrier that keeps coming up is that we have regulators to deal with medical diagnosis. We do not have regulators to deal with how do we get better information so people can make better decisions. So we have the wrong regulator deciding on the wrong criteria this important thing that we need to do. So that is a challenge going forward, and there is a little bit of leeway of activity going and trying to push for that right now, but I see that as a big thing. So in other words, the bottom line is that the patent system is invariably the thing that energizes the market system for innovation. The problem is what we have here is a need for such an accelerated timeline and compromises on things that firms do not, typically compromise on, quality, liability, and other things like that, that it really exacerbates the coordination required to get all this going.
Maybe a question, Lisa, about truly about are we going to face IP problem in the future regarding the vaccine launch, etc.? And my thinking is that, well, for the first time, maybe we'll be in a position where a pharma product, whatever drugs or vaccine, will be launched before the publication will be ever published in the database. So most of the patent litigation surrounding the pharma market right now are based on patents which have been published, granted, so anyone knows, and there is no asymmetry of information. But in that case, if hopefully we get a first launch of vaccine by the end of the year or next beginning of the next year, well, probably the patent will not be issued before the end of the next year. So to which extent, from a, I would say, legal point of view, this will make the situation different than what happened in the past. So
I think that's right. I think some of the, I mean, there have been many of the vaccine technologies that are being worked on now are based on research that has been done earlier. So like the new mRNA vaccines, we have not yet had a mRNA vaccine approved. So it's a novel platform, risky, we don't know whether it will work, but it's based on substantial investments that these firms, including Moderna, have made before 2020 in this technology. And I assume that it has been heavily patented by those firms. We don't, I mean, I haven't done an extensive look at what patents have been published so far on that. And that's another thing that makes vaccines and other biologics more complicated than small molecule drugs, and that there aren't the same degree of listings and matching of how many patents are actually covering these products. But you're right that the timeline, because of how rapidly this is moving forward, is much more compressed than is typically true in the pharmaceutical world. And so the patent issues won't be worked out at the time when a vaccine hopefully is approved, if the most optimistic timelines are right, which may not be the case. I mean, as you know, all of the leading candidates right now could fail.
yeah.
I had a question on how economists have speculated that this shock from COVID-19 beyond vaccines and therapeutics is both on the supply and demand side, and what that might mean for how we should think about the normative IP system beyond just vaccines and therapeutics for both general purpose technology platforms like mRNA platforms versus application sector like repurposing drugs, etc. And I worry about this, especially coming from India, because tomorrow when there's a vaccine out there, I'll be taken back to 20 years back in what happened in HIV, where the initial launch was by Gilead, I think, with a $10,000 product of that 3-drug HIV drug combination. And then soon it was brought down through generic entry in a world where legal mechanisms are not protecting the innovators in entering the market. So I would love your reactions to that, both Lisa and Josh, on first, what do you think would be the normative IP system related to the GPT platforms versus application sectors? And second, how could competition complicate this issue? I do have another question on innovation prices, but we'll come back to that later.
I think your question was about innovation prices, or at the very least, advanced market commitments. I mean, to go on the second one first, Lisa was absolutely right. There is a big problem that we face during a major public health crisis when you've got a mass market, or when you've got a mass requirement for keeping prices at the levels that the US health system has long felt comfortable with. So, you know, that's a problem that it's immediate hit. And so the solution to that is an advanced market commitment that says, okay, yeah, you won't earn as much on each treatment, but your dose, you'll make it up in volume. And also we'll abate risk by agreeing to satisfy demand right away. So, you know, that's the traditional solution. In terms of GPTs versus application centers, I don't know if anyone's actually thought fully about all the IP and that, aside from saying it's really bad if GPTs are protected by IP, general purpose technologies. If the transistor had an ironclad patent on it, you know, that would just delay stuff. So it's kind of like, the miracle is that our general purpose technologies have sort of come from the public sphere or the scientific sphere, and thank goodness, because I wouldn't want to worry about patents on them.
Lisa?
I think I agree with all of that. I mean, I don't know what the patent landscape looks like for something like the mRNA technologies, as I said in response to Philippe earlier. I think it is important that the investments that private firms have made in these technologies, with the expectation of hopefully having something that makes a profit, that I mean, like Moderna before the pandemic was investing in mRNA technology, not knowing what the resulting what would eventually be successful. But by the end of 2019, they had accumulated losses of 1.5 billion in their efforts on working on this so far. So like they're making these investments with the expectation that something that they do will eventually be profitable. And if this turns out to be the technology that is valuable, then I think it is important that that investment be rewarded, and that we think about ways, like if this is a useful technology for vaccine development going forward, to make it so that many firms are able to work on it.
Let me add to that, is that I think with a thing like Moderna and mRNA technology, I think that they are taking advantage of this opportunity to have a huge success with it. And it would not concern me whether they earn profits above their costs, about the cost for this particular one, because if it works and it was able to be purposed quickly, they'll be able to go to all manner of governments around the world and say, well, there's going to be another pandemic. The last thing you want is not to be prepared. We need to do X, Y, and Z investment to make sure that we are not dealing with this in 12-month lag, but a 1-month lag or something great like that. And so I think they'll be able to make that case. So in other words, I think their business is going, if you're making a platform like that, their business is in people understanding it is worth paying for the platform ahead of time. And I think at the moment, if you are in this business of selling innovations that are going to be platforms that are going to insure people against future pandemics, whatever happens here is just a gold mine to making that case.
Interesting. There are a couple of questions on the chat window. Philip, do you want to bring that into the conversation? So
Yeah.
Jaideep has asked about state tax exemptions.
Yeah.
Sunita has asked about vaccine nationalism. Yeah.
The question of offer is like, do we need over incentive to stimulate the market to produce innovation? My answer as a MD looking at what is in the pipeline, I would say no. Because, for example, right now on the market, for the past century, less than 100 different vaccines have been developed, okay? And just in a few months, almost 100 different vaccine projects are in the pipeline. So I think the solution, the theoretical solution of the pandemics doesn't need any more incentive. All the world is working on to find a solution. And therefore I would challenge the idea, even it's EPIP conference, and we are here to talk about IP and the importance of IP to incentivize innovation. I will say that in that case, the access to the vaccine is not linked to the IP problem. It's more, the true challenge would be to scale up the production at such a dimension that we never face, as Joshua mentioned earlier on during his presentation. So, and therefore, I never thought about that, but I truly, Lisa pointed out what could make the difference. Imagine in a few months, there will be a candidate vaccine among some failure, which will reach the market. Therefore, it means that the different companies in the world who have the plant, manufacturing plant to produce a large lot of vaccine will collaborate. But this might be, there will be barriers to collaboration because of a trade secret. And so the question is that how we can turn around this trade secret in order to facilitate maybe there is a solution. It's known, I mean, the pharma industry is already doing quite a lot of cross-licensing on many technology. So, yeah.
I think on the trade secret issue, I mean, it's worth distinguishing between the problem of a given vaccine that is successful being licensed to a bunch of different manufacturers, and like right now, because of the importance of the developer in transferring their know-how, having their involvement is important in this, and they will have a strong profit incentive given that the demand is going to weigh out seed supply, at least in the short term. So it makes sense to find multiple manufacturing partners to license the vaccine, that one that turns out to be successful. I think the bigger concern, where there isn't a incentive right now, and where it's more important to think about ways to encourage more knowledge sharing, is that the investments that firms make in vaccine manufacturing technology that are the insights they gain that are relevant to competitors, they have no incentive to share that. And Nicholson Price at the University of Michigan has written a number of things about this, the problems with innovation in the manufacturing space for biopharmaceuticals more generally, and the way this is generally kept as secrets, and various regulatory and legal hurdles have led to less innovation than would be optimal in this space. But I think this is one of the policy problems that policymakers should be thinking about.
About the new lives we are leading, think about if we didn't have these work from home tools like Zoom and Meets or Teams, right? What would life look like? And we already see competition coming from local players. Like in India, there is a imitator of Zoom from Reliance Industries. Now, how do they protect rents, the incumbent and the entrant? And Zoom is constantly updating its product features as well, right? So it would be nice to have some thoughts both from Josh and Lisa on the normative implication of IP and competition play in beyond this health and pharma story as well, given that this is also happening. Josh, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I mean, it's, you know, obviously you can see that there was some, you know, I mean, if you went around the world and you looked for startups that likely, you know, we've got conspiracy theories of the coronavirus, you know, accidental labs coming from space now. But really, actually, when you think about it, the people who had the biggest motives were your Zoom and your Peloton and your things who needed a boost right at that stage when they had a product on the market and were able to scale it out. So I would be looking there for, I feel the conspiracy theorists are not imaginative enough. So but the thing is that with respect to that, these things are working well. I mean, the biggest surprise, let us be very clear. The biggest surprise with regard to Zoom is that it didn't fall over. You know, in any other startup that had a sudden, unplanned, massive scale and usage that Zoom has had to have. You know, even if you're an incumbent firm, you'd have trouble dealing. You're a Microsoft or a Google. You know, that would have been challenging. And to have actually done so and provided their product and sustained it, that's fantastic. And I think as you know, management scholars, it will be very interesting to hear more about the history of Zoom. Obviously, we are seeing with respect to other things, and this is with my testing and contact tracing and things, you know, these have all had to be done from behind. They're working from behind. So we've been unable to scale those things nearly as neatly. I don't know what also the inter-country differences are when all of a sudden you had everybody working from home. My internet is actually out today, believe it or not. But this is really the first time I've had a long outage in the 6 months I've been at home, and now I'm on wireless instead, and it seems to be fine. That's a pretty big change as well. That was a big movement as well. And you know, one could imagine if this was just 5 years ago, this would all have been a much bigger disaster. So I find it's going to be, you know, these sorts of changes have been combinations of miracles, which also should clue us into what did we miss out on with regard to that. I suspect, you know, if I had to pick a candidate that we missed out on, is everybody having one of these health monitoring sensors
Devices
on them. Currently cost, you know, between $200 and $400. if we, you know, in 5 years' time, those might be cheap enough that most people would have them. And can you imagine the data we would have gained? They would probably know already in advance if somebody was infected with.
Does the high stake in vaccine access for COVID make a case for a general exception in IP protection?
Separate the access for patients from the incentive provided for developers. And you can do that either by purchasing from the patentee whatever their patented product is and then distributing it for free, or by purchasing the patent and then putting that in the public domain and allowing competition and open access distribution then. For things like small molecule drugs, many of the HIV/AIDS treatments, the having generic competition to lower prices was an effective strategy to promote access. As I explained at the beginning, for vaccines, that they are different because of the barriers to production. We can't get rid of patents and expect generic entry. And so I don't think a patent buyout would be an effective strategy there. But we can still, and it's not a hypothetical academic point, like most national health systems, because they're providing free access to vaccines and rewarding inventors, like there is a real separation of those two issues that I think needs to be recognized. So I think the answer to the question in the Q&A of like, should we have a special exemption for IP protection in spheres with such high access stakes? No, I mean, these are the most important spheres in which to provide a strong ex post reward to developers, whether that's through the governments paying for it from the pharmaceuticals or some other policy.
There was an initiative, still going on, an important initiative involving Mark Lemley and Frank Titze, who is another board member of EPIP, the Open Patent Pledge. I've been following it. You may know also about it. Do you have any comments? Because what I realized, maybe Frank is in the audience, I don't know, is that few pharma companies were joining it. It was more IT firms. So, but lots of them were joining. So it's interesting, an interesting experiment. Any comments about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it illustrates the differences I was talking about between the tech and the pharmaceutical industries. And for pharmaceutical development, without having a strong reward for investment, I mean, even outside the pandemic context, even we're just thinking about small molecule drugs, drugs regularly get dropped from pharmaceutical pipelines if they don't have patents on them to allow recoupment of the investment there. So if you make all of these, get rid of the patents on things for which they can be easily copied, then that removes that incentive for investment. For things like vaccines, I think that, as I said, the patents are largely irrelevant. And so it's not clear what the pledge would do.
Getting a lot of money to create the vaccine, and is there an IPR provision built into those grants that they are receiving for epidemic preparedness innovations?
Once again, for me, the problem that we are facing is not regarding the development of the vaccine product, is to produce the vaccine when we'll be there. So I will be more aware about trade secret, as Lisa mentioned, for example. Just put some numbers. I mean, the industry is claiming that they could produce like more than 1 billion doses to vaccinate the population. So if you take the number, it would take more than 5 years to vaccinate everyone in the planet, okay? So, and it means also by that time, they will stop producing flu vaccine, hemophilus vaccine, and so on. So the only way for the industry to answer to this changing situation is to build new manufacturing plants. And building a manufacturing plant for vaccines is between like 50 million to $500 million. So therefore, I came back to just what said Lisa, the pharmaceutical industry need the idea not to recover the cost of development, but truly to recover the cost of producing, building new plants and so on. So I think that's my opinion.
Absolutely.
I agree with that.
Any message, take-home message from the three of you?
Reiterate that I think like we should be focusing on designing vaccine innovation incentives during and in anticipation of future pandemics, with the goal of generating effective vaccines as quickly and safely as possible, while recognizing that we also have many policies that can provide access.
I would like to highlight a paper that came out last year, I think, by Hedy Williams and others from Stanford, looking at the role of superstar firms and its role in inequality in society. So we are not living in just an innovation discussion here, but how technology and IP systems fostering technology may have distributional consequences. I hope that what we learned from this COVID-19 situation has like welfare implications in that kind of inequality consequence kind of.
My take-home message? Well, I will challenging the EPIP and say, maybe it's not a matter of IP issue.
Thank you very much. See you next time physically, I hope. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for organizing.